Welcome to Conversation with Friends. This is an authentic discussion of how faith interacts or engages with culture. And so it's authentic because sometimes it's always changing, right? And so, but which kind of gets me into what we're talking about this week. Last week off air, Karla, when we got done, you said, did we say anything? And I was like, that's funny because we've been kind of talking kind of up here, like, and kind of in the clouds. And so it got me thinking of like this idea of like questions and the third way and like when we ask questions. And I think sometimes I struggle, but I think people in general with questions struggle because faith or God feels certain and he feels immovable, right? And then when we're asking questions, it makes it feel like, wait, is God moving, or like, is God movable, or are we questioning God? And then eventually we kind of go to this point where everything is just kind of like fluid and like it feels disingenuous a little bit when we're kind of staying above. And so how do we, I guess when we think of Jesus as a firm foundation or God as a rock or a refuge, those seem solid. Mm-hmm. But then how do questions fit with that?
When I think about that, I like the word, you use the word immovable when you talk about God. I mean,
Right.
I think that's a true statement. I would say Scripture affirms that. But we are not immovable. So
Right.
God is immovable, but we are in a constant growth pattern in our lives to discover the vastness of what the Scriptures call the backside of God, right? Mm-hmm. So those things, that's the paradox of faith, right? So yes, God is, or Christ is the rock. It's our firm foundation. It's what makes us feel safe. The word refuge you used, all of those things. At the same time, there is a call to us to constantly question or move toward the immovable, right? And that's the paradox that we're constantly in. So I think what you're making an assumption that questions mean you're not firm. And I don't know that that's true.
So let me go with that a little bit farther. So yeah, so the reason I feel, because then some people, if you ask questions, they're going to be like, well, okay, great, but where do you stand? Like, if Jesus was always asking questions, like, where did he stand? Like, what was his, like, core? What was his central value that that if you ever, like, came to that, he was like, no, we're standing right here? Or is that incorrect language, I guess?
I mean, I would say, what do you think? I feel like that even answering that with a question is the point.
You're doing it
that there is something about people wanting to pin down Jesus. But that
Right.
wasn't about Jesus, that was about themselves.
Right.
And so we, as we talked about last week, are in a culture that wants to label and categorize. And I don't know that, like, Jesus fought against that, not because he wasn't firm, but because the question wasn't important. It was like asking what color is square. It didn't make sense or matter for his firmness, for his stance. It was about them. It wasn't about. And I think we do the same thing, don't you think?
Okay, so instead of telling you what I think, let's get out of here. Let's get out of this area and let's bring it down to like practical, ground level, like life on life kind of stuff. So obviously the big kind of cultural debate or the big cultural question has to do with like the pandemic that we're in and like masks and vaccinations and do we need to wear them? And you have Christians on one side that are like, the whole thing feels like it's like we're overblowing it or it's a hoax, and so we don't need either. And then you have Christians on the other side that are like, we should be like uber vaccinated and be wearing masks all the time. I don't know how we haven't been doing it before. And then we have this middle where most of us live, I would agree, I would think. And these are the ones that are like being disenfranchised and mocked and ridiculed because we're not on one side or the other. And so it feels kind of like, I guess we're like floundering a little bit. And so then we feel like we have to go to one pole or the other. So how do we navigate that with this third way? How do we live in that, live in this middle where we're just kind of being mocked and ridiculed and told that we need to choose a side?
R.O, could you have picked a more controversial topic this morning?
Sorry about that, everyone.
I think it does connect back to what you said earlier, that science is obviously fluid. Well, I don't know if it
Right.
is obvious. I think
Right.
for those that understand science, recognize that it's constantly changing.
Right,
That's
because you're always looking at, you're testing theories, and then
Right.
you're like going, oh, that theory didn't work, so let's try this, and then
Totally.
so it's you change.
and you're
Right.
uncovering new things, and so
Right.
science changes.
That makes sense.
And so I think a lot of the hesitation around masks, meaning this is a hoax, or hesitation around vaccines, is we can't trust science. They keep talking out both sides of their mouths. Well, that's just science.
Right.
That's what science is. But the thing is, faith is the same way. Faith is also constantly being uncovered. And even though God is immovable, we are constantly moving towards God, right? So our questions allow us. And so, but when you live in a camp where science is static, which is some of our world right now, it's also connected to theology. So faith is also static. And so you make decisions out of that staticness.
Right, right.
And I think that's causing a lot of, whether we acknowledge it or not, theology is having a huge influence on what's happening in our culture right now with masks or no masks, or vaccines or no vaccines. And we are confused. We are confused because we are used as an American culture with faith being static, faith not being dynamic.
And so this might be too much. So then, should we be getting vaccinated?
Oh, R.O., right
Or is
to
that
the
no?
question.
Or should we leave that for them? Or should we be wearing masks? I mean, as a Christian, what is my response to that?
Yeah.
Or what should my response be?
I mean, my understanding, and you could speak to this too, is just from my limited understanding of those that don't want to wear masks or don't want to get vaccines. It has to do with, this is my choice, my body.
Right.
It's an individual mandate. And I think we find a lot of those folks, I think, within the evangelical far-right community, because they've been taught a theology that is me-centered. And so, which I believe is
So we have the iPhone and we have the I God, the I theology.
Yeah, I
right?
think so.
Everything's
I think it's a
all about you.
misinterpretation of Scripture. I mean, we've been taught, sadly, and as a pastor, I feel very much like I've fed into this in many ways, a theology in America that is we read the Bible through eyes of the personal Jesus, the personal God.
Right.
Not recognizing that the Bible was written and never meant to be read outside of the community or studied outside of the community. And so we read the Bible in a way that it was never created to be read or experienced.
Right.
And that has completely messed up our view of the world.
Right. I mean, I heard the printing press kind of changed everything, right? Because now the Bible was available to individuals. And so now you could take the Bible home, read it, study it, look at it, and say, oh, this is what I think it says. But there's no communal accountability. There's no communal discussion about it, where Paul's letters or just scripture in general was stories being told, and it was told in the community, and they talked about it. They would dialogue with it. It was a living document.
It was a living document.
Right.
And even think about the letters of Paul that were circulated from church to church to church.
Right.
They weren't meant to ever be read. It's not a letter to you personally. And so when a theology is built on the personal, or a theology is built on, this is about me and God and myself and my choices, then obviously vaccines and masks become about me. And so we have no ability, and that's backed up by a theological foundational, what I would see as a more static faith.
So let me ask you this. Do you feel like there's anywhere in the world, is this an America problem? Is this a white problem? Is this a rich person problem? Is there anywhere that that scripture is still being read communally? I mean, we would like to claim that we're doing it, but we're
not doing it.
Yeah, right.
I think so. I think more, the West imported a lot of the Christianity in our world, exported a lot of the Christianity in our world.
Right,
So,
and because everybody, it seems like everybody speaks English, or we expect them to, and we believe everybody should be reading the scripture as we do. Is there any place that's safe from us?
Right, that
our
we can
individual
destroy.
Right.
I mean, I think there's definitely remnants of that. I think in Eastern culture, Christians are far more communal because that's their cultural norm, which is more appropriate to where Jesus stood. So I think it's happening. I think it is the worst in the West, and which is why we have the largest numbers of COVID and the least amount of vaccinations and all of those things, because we cannot, our theology is, our interpretation of Scripture is so deeply connected to our practical living that we cannot separate those things, you know, which is a good thing. We can't separate it,
Right.
but it's a bad thing when it's bad theology.
Right.
You know, what do you think?
That just overwhelms me and feels like hopeless a little bit.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, gosh, I'm just like listening to that. I'm like, it's kind of like, well, just make your own choice, and it's all individual anyway. So, you know what I'm saying? It doesn't feel, and then so when people come and say, well, we wear masks or we get vaccinated, not for yourself, but for the people to your right and to your left, that doesn't feel,
It feels oppressive in our
it feels
culture.
oppressive, right? It
Yes.
doesn't feel like a heroic or valiant. It feels like, oh, you're trying to oppress me.
Yeah, which is interesting. You know that phrase we use a lot? We use it in the church too, but in American culture, I'm not my brother's keeper. You know that phrase? That is not biblical, just so you know. In the Bible, it's exact opposite. We are indeed our brother's keeper.
Right.
And so
And
it's,
sisters and children and
Right.
grandmothers, right?
but we have adopted that as a theological stance of the church, and it's like, where did that come from? Like, the Scripture is full of a call to be your brother's and your sister's keeper, and that grace upon you extends to them, and sin that you participate in extends to them. It's sort of fascinating.
How do we get back to the communal? How do we, like, even correct, like, when I think of like our Sunday worship services, or how do we get back to doing it communally and correctly? I heard N.T. Wright say that we need to read Scripture in bigger chunks as a community, and just instead of we kind of, most pastors, not you of course, but
Definitely me.
but some that we read it in, like, 5 to 7 verses or whatever it is, but he's like, we need to get back to reading chapters and like big chunks of Scripture, which I thought was interesting as like a way as a response to getting back. But
how do we do that? That's a good question. I know in my personal journey, there was an 18-month period in my life where I intentionally did not read the Bible for personal devotion, which sounds like an apostasy, I'm sure, for people, especially knowing that I'm a pastor.
Personnel committee's like, excuse me.
Yeah. But it was intentional. There was an intentional separation, because I found that I was worshiping the Bible and my interpretation of the Bible more than I was worshiping God. And so I set it aside, and I read it only in
That's
communal
another
context.
episode, by the way.
It's
Go
another
ahead.
episode,
Anyway.
but I read it only in communal context or in study with others, or and it changed my entire perspective on how to read the Scriptures.
Right.
To be able to do that. So I think a call to our folks, our folks, I would suspect, aren't as biblically
Literate?
well, I don't think literate, but aren't doing biblical reading on their own as much as other denominations.
Right,
probably.
right. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
But I think there is a call to be intentional in that communal space with the reading of Scripture and how to dissect it, don't you think?
Yeah. Well, this is totally, sorry, I feel like this is like, we're going totally different direction.
Back to masks.
But even with like teaching though, like how we teach, like it's usually pastor stands up there up front and says it. And there's there's not necessarily like a communal response. We're watching a show, so to speak. Like like folks here are watching a show in a weird way, right? But how do we? Yeah, it's just how do we?
We are definitely contributors to that, and I feel like
and we have to be more intentional that when the camera goes off, when the service is over, that we're somehow empowering people. Go talk about this, go discuss this. Let's, I remember. One story when I was in high school, we would always sit. We sat close to the pastor, front row, so we could hear what he said. And then we always grabbed lunch afterwards, and we would talk about we would always say, what did you think about what Pastor Paul said, or whatever. And, sometimes we'd have long discussions, sometimes it'd be short, but I didn't even know it at the time, but that was, I think, the point of what we're supposed to do with this this communal learning, that you hear it, let's discuss it in a community. And even though it was just our little group of like high school kids or whatever, but I look back and I was like, we were getting something partially right there, but maybe that we need to get back into that. And instead of formalizing small groups, no. After you leave, go talk about it. Go have lunch together, eat, and discuss. And
to take that back, I know this. We should probably wrap this up. But to take it back to masks and vaccines, it's those tiny practices, I think, that grow your understanding of Scripture to be more communal, and that changes your theology. So to go back to the original question, do I think we should be vaccinated? It really doesn't matter what I think. I mean, I think from a biblical perspective, there is a call in the scripture for communal living, to care for the community, for sure. And I think public health is certainly a care for the community. I mean, you look at the scripture, particularly Jesus' time, and in the Old Testament even more so, with the clean and the unclean, and the unclean were separated. That would be like the virus, right, taking over someone's life, because uncleanliness,
right,
moved throughout the community pretty quickly. But there was always ritualistic or something to return them. The most important thing was a return to the community, by far.
The healing really happened when they were integrated back into the community.
Correct.
It wasn't the physical touch, it was the integration back into
but
the
they
community.
went through process.
Right,
What
right.
can we do to return them? That
Yes.
was the most important thing. So we're in a time right now where it's like, what can we do to return our society back to the community? And we are instead fighting against that. That was certainly an ideal of the Old Testament. It was an ideal of Christ to return to the community. And so Christ, because with God's grace, that was his purpose. He came down and started spewing cleanness on people instead of uncleanness, so that the community could be together. And so, do I think we should work as hard as we can to bring the community back together? Absolutely.
And whatever that takes.
And whatever that takes. Yeah. From a biblical perspective. Anyway.
That's awesome. Well, thank you. So that's going to be it. That was good. So I think today, one of the things that kind of stood out for me, maybe is a question for you guys, is where's your faith static? What are those things that you're holding on to that you feel like can't move, and that maybe God is saying, no, you can move a little bit, but know that I'm always going to be central to your life. And so think about that. Write it in your comments. We want to hear what you're going through. We want to hear your process in this whole thing. We are, just two voices, but we know that there are many more out there. So please continue to subscribe to our YouTube page if you haven't. If you're new, welcome. And also like us on Facebook. And we will see you guys next week. Thank you.